The notary cleared his throat and set down his pen. He looked across the table at my parents and said, quietly, "Do you know what your daughter does for a living?" My father didn't answer right away. He looked at me the way he always had, like I was a problem he'd never quite figured out how to solve. I sat with my hands folded on the table and said nothing. I grew up in a small town outside of Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business and your grandmother's business too. The winters were long and the summers smelled like pine and lake water, and for most of my childhood, that was enough. I was the middle child. My older brother had gone into the trades right out of high school. Electrician, good money, steady work. My father never missed a chance to mention it. My younger sister had married early, had 2 kids by 24, lived 10 minutes from our parents. My mother called her every single day. And then there was me. I'd left at 17 for a summer job in Ottawa that turned into a university application, that turned into a degree in civil engineering, that turned into a career that took me further and further from Sudbury every year. I didn't plan it that way. It just kept going, one thing leading to the next. And somewhere in there, the distance between me and my family stopped being measured in kilometers. We weren't estranged, exactly. I came home for Christmas most years. I sent birthday cards. When my mother had her hip replaced 2 winters ago, I took 2 weeks off and drove up to help her through physio. But I was never the child they talked about at the dinner table. I was never the one they understood. What I did for work, I worked on infrastructure projects, mostly bridges and highway overpasses. And for the past 6 years, I'd been contracted through a federal program to assess and rebuild aging bridges in remote northern communities. It was not something my parents could picture. My father once told a neighbor I worked for the government, something with roads. My mother's version was that I traveled a lot for work. Neither of them had ever asked me a single question about it. That was fine. I had accepted it a long time ago. What I had not accepted, what I was still, even sitting in that notary's office trying to make sense of, was what had happened 3 months earlier when my grandfather passed away. His name was Walter, and he was the best person I have ever known. He'd built his own house outside of Chelmsford with lumber he'd milled himself. He had a wood stove he'd been feeding since 1974 and a garden that produced more zucchini than any one man could reasonably use. He taught me how to read a level, how to set a fence post, how to look at a structure and understand what was holding it up. When I was 12, I told him I wanted to build things. He took that seriously. He drove me to the library in town and helped me find books on engineering and architecture. He sat with me at his kitchen table on Saturday mornings while I worked through problems I didn't fully understand yet, and he never once said it was too much for a girl from Sudbury to want. My parents thought it was a phase. He passed in February, quickly, which was a mercy. A stroke on a Tuesday and gone by Thursday. I drove up from Toronto in a snowstorm and made it just in time to sit with him for those last hours. I held his hand. I talked to him about the bridge project I was finishing up in a community north of Timmins. I don't know if he heard me, but I like to think he did. After the funeral, my father told me that my grandfather had left the property to him. The house, the land, the barn, all of it. He said it had been discussed. He said it made sense since he was the eldest child and he lived closest and someone needed to make decisions about it. I didn't argue. I went back to Toronto. I let 3 weeks go by. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a notary in Chelmsford who introduced himself as the one handling my grandfather's estate. He told me, carefully, that there was a will. A formal, witnessed, properly filed will, and that I should probably come in. My parents were already at the table when I arrived. My mother had her coat on like she was ready to leave at any moment. My father had his arms crossed. My brother was there too, sitting slightly apart from everyone like he wasn't sure which side he was on. The notary. A quiet man named Mr. Arsenault, careful with his words, began to go through the document. My grandfather had left the house and the land to me, not to my father, not to be divided among the family, to me specifically, with a handwritten note attached to the will that said, She'll know what to do with it. She always understood what things are for. My mother made a sound I'd never heard from her before. My father's face went very still. "This can't be right," my father said. Mr. Arsenal confirmed that it was. "She doesn't even live here. She travels all the time. She has no roots. What is she going to do with the property in Chelmsford?" "That's not really a legal question," Mr. Arsenal said gently. "She doesn't deserve it." My mother said it quietly, but she said it. She was never here. She left. She was never here. She left. She was never part of this family the way she should have been. She can't just walk in and take what should belong to people who actually stayed. I felt it move through me. That old familiar weight, the one I'd been carrying since I was 17 and chose a direction no one in my family could follow. I had stopped expecting their approval years ago, but hearing it said out loud in a room with a notary and a will and fluorescent lighting still landed somewhere I hadn't expected. I didn't speak. I had decided before I walked in that I would not defend myself. My grandfather had already said what needed to be said. My father leaned forward. She had no relationship with him, not a real one. She came for holidays. She called sometimes. That's not the same as being there. Mr. Arsenault set down his pen. He looked across the table and said, quietly, "Do you know what your daughter does for a living?" My father frowned. "She works for the government, roads, something like that." The notary opened a folder and slid a single page across the table. "Your father kept records," he said. "He was quite organized. This is a list he gave me when we drew up the will 2 years ago to be included in the estate file." My father picked it up. My mother leaned over to look. It was a list of the projects I had worked on over the previous 8 years. My grandfather had written it himself in his careful print handwriting, and it was more complete than anything I could have put together from memory. Every bridge, every community, the scope of each project, the federal program it was under. He'd written a note beside 3 of them, roads into places that didn't have good roads before. Beside one remote community in northern Ontario, he'd written, "Ambulances can get through now." My father read it slowly. My mother had gone quiet. "He kept this," my father said. "He kept everything she ever sent him," Mr. Arsenault said. "Photographs, project summaries, news articles from local papers in those communities. He had a folder. He showed it to me the day we signed the will. He was very proud." I looked at my hands. I had sent my grandfather updates on my work the same way I would have told him about any other part of my life. Not to impress him, just because he was someone who was actually interested. He'd asked questions every time, wanted to know about the soil conditions, the load calculations, what kind of winters the structures had to withstand. He understood more than most people I worked with. I hadn't known he was keeping all of it. He talked about her, Mr. Arsenault continued, and now he was speaking more to my parents than to me. When we met to do this, he talked about her for almost an hour. He said she was the one who reminded him of himself when he was young, said she had the same thing he had. She looked at something broken and wanted to fix it. My father put the paper down. He didn't say anything for a long time. My mother was looking at me differently now. Not softly, it wasn't that sudden or that simple, but differently. Like she was trying to recalculate something she'd been sure of for a long time. "You never told us," she said finally, "about any of this. You never asked," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth. We sat in that office for almost another hour. My parents did not contest the will. There was nothing to contest. It was airtight, drawn up properly, signed and witnessed. But that wasn't why they stopped. I think they stopped because something had shifted in that room that couldn't be unshifted. My brother walked me to my car afterward. He stood in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "I didn't know either, you know, about what you actually do." "I know," I said. "You could have said something." I tried a few times. When I started the federal contract, when the first project was finished, I looked at him. Nobody was very interested. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue with that. I drove back to the house, my house now, though it would take a long time before that word sat right, and I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table for a while in the quiet. The wood stove was cold. The garden was buried under February snow. But the bones of the place were exactly as I remembered them, solid, careful, built to last. I thought about what I wanted to do with it. I had spent 6 years building things in places that needed them. I knew what it meant when a road got through to somewhere it hadn't reached before, when a bridge opened up a community that had been cut off by seasonal flooding for decades. I knew what infrastructure meant when it wasn't abstract, when it was a kid getting to school without a 2-hour detour or a family getting to a hospital on time. My grandfather had known that too. He'd known it in his bones, in the way he'd built his own house and set his own fence posts, and understood that a thing built well was a gift to everyone who came after you. I didn't want to sell the property. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it yet, but I knew I didn't want to sell it. My parents came by the following morning. I hadn't expected that. My mother brought food, a container of soup, some biscuits, the particular language of apology she'd always used when she didn't have the words for apology. She set it on the counter and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. "I don't know very much about what you do," she said. "That was true yesterday, and it's still true. But I think," she stopped, started again. "I think we made it easy for ourselves not to know. And that wasn't fair to you. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a tearful breakdown. She's not that kind of woman, and neither am I. And maybe that's one of the ways we're more alike than we've ever admitted." My father stood by the door for a moment, and then he came and sat at the table. He looked at the wood stove for a while. "Your grandfather was a better listener than me," he said. "Always was. He was," I agreed. "You're like him." I looked at him. I looked at him. "I know." We sat there in the kitchen for a while, the three of us, not talking much but not needing to. The soup heated up on the stove. Outside, the snow had started again. The soft, heavy kind that settles on everything and makes the world quiet. It wasn't fixed. These things don't get fixed in a morning over soup. Not after 30 years of accumulating distance. But something had opened up that had been shut for a long time, and I was willing to see what grew in the space. My grandfather had left me a house and a piece of land in northern Ontario, and a folder full of every piece of work I'd ever told him about. He'd left me proof that someone had been paying attention all along, even when it didn't feel like anyone was. That was worth more than the property. That was the thing I'd needed someone to say out loud for a very long time. I put a log in the wood stove and got the fire going, and I sat by the window and watched the snow come down over the garden, and I let myself feel, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I think about that folder a lot. The one my grandfather kept in his desk. Every photograph I'd sent him, every project summary. The newspaper clippings from communities so small they barely showed up on a provincial map. He never told me he was keeping any of it. He just quietly paid attention year after year while the rest of the family moved on to other conversations. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about being overlooked. It's not always loud. It's not always cruel. Sometimes it's just a pattern of eyes that slide past you at the dinner table. A habit of asking your brother about his work and not yours. A silence so consistent you start to mistake it for the truth about yourself. I made that mistake for a long time. I thought the absence of interest meant the absence of worth. My grandfather knew better, and what he understood, what I've had to learn slowly, the hard way, is that doing the right thing without an audience is not a consolation prize. It's actually the whole point. I didn't spend 6 years rebuilding bridges in northern Ontario because I wanted my parents to be impressed. I did it because the work mattered. Because there were roads that needed to be passable and communities that had been waiting too long and problems that had real, concrete solutions if someone was willing to go figure them out. That kind of integrity doesn't need a witness to be real. But when a witness finally shows up, when someone pulls out a folder and lays it on a table, it turns out the record was always there. You just couldn't see it yet. Walter used to say that a structure built on a weak foundation will always tell you eventually. He meant it about engineering. I've come to think he meant it about everything. The choices I made when no one was watching. to stay on difficult contracts, to keep sending him updates, to drive up in a February snowstorm because he mattered to me. Those were the foundation. What happened in that notary's office was just the building finally showing itself. I'm not angry at my parents. I want to say that clearly because I've had time to sit with it now. They made it easy for themselves not to know me, and that cost all of us something real. But they're also people who built a life in a small town and raised 3 kids and did the best they understood how to do. My mother's soup on that kitchen counter the next morning was genuine. My father sitting at the table looking at the wood stove was genuine. These things don't fix 30 years in an afternoon, but genuine is a place to start. What I keep coming back to is this: the version of myself that drove away from Sudbury at 17, the one who chose the harder path because it was the right one, didn't do it with any certainty that it would ever be recognized. She did it because she had the sense to know what she was capable of, and the stubbornness to go find out if she was right. That kind of quiet self-knowledge, knowing what you can do even when nobody around you believes it, is maybe the most useful thing a person can carry. It doesn't photograph well, it doesn't come up at dinner parties, but it gets you through the years when the folder is still just sitting in a desk drawer, waiting. My grandfather left me a house with good bones and a garden that's going to need a lot of work come spring. I think I'll start with the fence posts.